Hello, I'm Allison, and welcome to another episode of Listen Now, Read Later, the podcast that leads you to your next favorite novel by reading you short stories. As always, we will be tying together short fiction and long-form fiction so that after you listen now, you can read later. Episode 6. I'm the problem, it's me. Today we're bringing you two short stories from horror legend Edgar Allan Poe. Afterward, Teresa will tell you why we have the perfect novel for you to read if today's stories were your cup of tea. Edgar Allan Poe lived from 1809 to 1849, dying less than 7 months after the publication of today's first story. One of the most influential writers of the English language, Poe originated the detective story and was the first well-known American writer to make a living from writing alone. Known for both his poetry and prose, Poe was also a literary critic. Remembered today for so many gothic horror stories that revolve around the idea of death, the cause of his own death remains unknown. Our first story today was originally published in 1849 under the title Hop Frog or the 8 Chained Orangutans in the weekly story paper The Flag of Our Union. These days you usually see it just called Hop Frog. Our second story, The Cask of Amontillado, was originally published in a November issue of Godey's Lady Book in 1846. We're reading both Hop Frog and The Cask of Amontillado from Barnes & Noble's Edgar Allan Poe Complete Tales and Poems. Both of today's stories are in the public domain, and most of Poe's short stories, including these, are also available on the website poestories.com. We hope you enjoy. Hop Frog by Edgar Allan Poe.
I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I have never been quite able to determine. But certain it is that a lean joker is a rara avis in terris. About the refinements, or as he called them, the ghost of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breadth in a jest, and would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over-niceties wearied him. He would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to the Zadig of Voltaire, and, upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore motley, with caps and bells, and who were expected to be always ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice, in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were as common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But, as I have already observed, your jesters, in 99 cases out of 100, are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self-gratulation with our king that, in Hopfrog, this was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hopfrog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent of the several ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hopfrog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement and, of course, consolation to the king, for, notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and a constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hopfrog, through the distortion of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along a road or a floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs enabled him to perform many feats of wonderful dexterity, where trees or ropes were in question or anything else to climb. At such exercises, he certainly much more resembled a squirrel or a small monkey than a frog. I am not able to say with precision from what country Hopfrog originally came. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hopfrog and a young girl very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever-victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the two little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hopfrog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not in his power to render Trippetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted. So she possessed much influence, and never failed to use it, whenever she could, for the benefit of Hopfrog. On some grand state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents both of Hopfrog and Trippetta were sure to be called into play. Hopfrog, in especial, was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters, and arranging costumes for masked balls that nothing could be done, it seems, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up under Trippetta's eye, with every kind of device which could possibly give éclat to the masquerade. The whole court was in a fever of expectation. As for costumes and characters, it might well be supposed that everybody had come to a decision on such points. Many had made up their minds as to what roles they should assume a week or even a month in advance, and, in fact, there was not a particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated I never could tell, unless they did it by way of a joke. More probably, they found it difficult, on account of being so fat, to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and, as a last resort, they sent for Trippetta and Hopfrog. When the 2 little friends obeyed the summons of the king, they found him sitting at his wine with his 7 ministers of his cabinet council, but the monarch appeared to be in a very ill humor. He knew that Hopfrog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes, and took pleasure in forcing Hopfrog to drink and, as the king called it, to be merry.
"Come here, Hopfrog,"
said he, as the jester and his friend entered the room.
"Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends."
Here Hopfrog sighed.
"And then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters, man. Something novel, out of the way. We are wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink. The wine will brighten your wits.
Hopfrog endeavored, as usual, to get up a jest in reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends forced the tears to his eyes. Many large, bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it, humbly, from the hand of the tyrant.
Ah, ha ha!
Roared the latter, as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker.
See what a glass of good wine can do. Why, your eyes are shining already.
Poor fellow, his large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table, and looked round upon the company with a half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke.
And now to business,
said the prime minister, a very fat man.
Yes,
said the king.
Come lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters. All of us. Ha ha ha.
And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh was chorused by the seven. Hopfrog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly.
Come,
said the king impatiently.
Have you nothing to suggest?
I am endeavoring to think of something novel,
replied the dwarf abstractedly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine.
Endeavoring?
Cried the tyrant fiercely.
What do you mean by that? Ah, I perceive. You are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this.
And he poured another goblet full and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath.
Drink, I say,
shouted the monster.
Or by the fiends.
The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat and, falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss what to do or say, how most becomingly to express his indignation. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. The poor girl got up the best she could and, not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or of a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh and protracted grating sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room.
What are you making that noise for?
Demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered, in great measure, from his intoxication, and looking fixedly but quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated.
How could it have been me?
The sound appeared to come from without,
observed one of the courtiers.
I fancy it was the parrot at the window, whetting his bill upon the cage wires.
True,
replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion.
But, on the honor of a knight, I could have sworn that it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth.
Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was too confirmed a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and, having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hopfrog entered at once, and with spirit, into the plans for the masquerade.
I cannot tell what was the association of the idea,
observed he, very tranquilly, and as if he had never tasted wine in his life.
But just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion, one of my own country frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires a company of 8 persons, and...
Here we are,
cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence.
8 to a fraction, I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion?
We call it,
replied the cripple,
the 8 chained orangutans, and it really is excellent sport if well enacted.
We will enact it,
remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids.
The beauty of the game
Continued Hop Frog.
lies in the fright it occasions among the women.
Capital! Roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry.
I will equip you as orangutans.
Proceeded the dwarf.
Leave all that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts. And of course, they will be as much terrified as astonished.
Oh, this is exquisite,
Exclaimed the king.
Hop Frog, I will make a man of you.
The chains are for the purpose of increasing the confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped, en masse, from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd of delicately and gorgeously habited men and women. The contrast is inimitable.
It must be,
Said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stockinette shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, some one of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 by ocular demonstration that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more efficiently represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First, it was passed about the waist of the king and tied, then about another of the party and also tied, then about all successively in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete, and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters, at right angles across the circle, after the fashion adopted at the present day by those who capture chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window at top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight and lowered or elevated by means of a counterbalance as usual. But, in order not to look unsightly, this latter passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Trippetta's superintendence, but, in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion it was that, on this occasion, the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which, in weather so warm, it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the saloon, could not all be expected to keep from out its center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall, out of the war, and a flambeau, emitting sweet odor, was placed in the right hand of each of the caryatides that stood against the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled, in all together, for the impediments of their chains caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind in reality, if not precisely orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have expiated their frolic in their blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and, at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for, in fact, there was much real danger from the pressure of the excited crowd, the chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves, at length, in its center, and, of course, in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed noiselessly at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically and at right angles. Here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and, as an inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered, in some measure, from their alarm, and, beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes.
"Leave them to me,"
now screamed Hop Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through all the din.
"Leave them to me. I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can soon tell who they are."
Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when, seizing a flambeau from one of the caryatides, he returned as he went to the center of the room, leaping with the agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain. Holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming,
"I shall soon find out who they are."
And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, when the chain flew violently up for about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in mid-air between the skylight and the floor. Hop Frog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down toward them, as though endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished was the whole company at this ascent that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by just such a slow, harsh, grating sound as had before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors when the former threw the wine in the face of Trippetta. But, on the present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth and glared with an expression of maniacal rage into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions.
"Aha!"
said at length the infuriated jester.
"Aha! I begin to see who these people are now."
Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks of the multitude who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken, and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length, the flames suddenly increasing in virulence forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, to be out of their reach, and, as he made his movement, the crowd sank again, for a brief instant, into silence. The dwarf seized his opportunity, and once more spoke.
"I now see distinctly,"
he said,
"what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors. A king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hop Frog, the jester, and this is my last jest.
Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid, blackened, hideous, and indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been the accomplice of her friend in his fiery revenge, and that, together, they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again.
We hope you enjoyed our first story. Next we have The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe.
The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato case to doubt my good will. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity, to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gimmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack, but in the matter of old wines he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you look today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts."
"How?"
said he.
"Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible. And in the middle of the carnival."
"I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price, without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain."
"Amontillado!
"I have my doubts."
Amontillado!
"And I must satisfy them."
Amontillado!
"As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucchesi. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me."
Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry."
"And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own."
"Come, let us go."
"Whither?"
"To your vaults."
"My friend, no. I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucchesi."
"I have no engagement. Come."
"My friend, no. It is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with niter."
"Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado, you have been imposed upon, and as for Lucchesi, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado."
Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself on my arm. Putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a roquelaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at my home. They had absconded to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well know, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode.
"The pipe,"
said he. "It is farther on," said I, "but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned towards me, and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication.
"Niter,"
he asked at length. "Niter," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" My friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes.
"It is nothing,"
he said at last. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy, as once was I. You are a man to be missed. For me it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucchesi,"
"Enough,"
he said.
"The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough."
True, I replied. "And indeed I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper caution. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damps." Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle, which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mold. "Drink," I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly, while his bells jingled.
"I drink,"
he said,
"to the buried that repose around us."
"and I to your long life." He again took my arm, and we proceeded.
"These vaults,"
he said,
"are extensive."
"The Montresors," I replied, "were a great and numerous family."
"I forget your arms."
"A huge human foot d'or, in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel."
"And the motto?"
"Nemo me impune licessit,"
"Good."
he said. The wine sparkled in his eyes, and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the Medoc. We had passed through walls of piled bones with casks and puncheons intermingling, and to the inmost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. "The nitre," I said. "See, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough,"
"It is nothing,"
he said.
"Let us go on. But first, another draught of the Medoc."
I broke and reached him a flasson of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one.
"You do not comprehend?"
he said. "Not I," I replied.
"Then you are not of the Brotherhood.
"How?"
You are not of the Masons."
Yes, I said. Yes.
"You? Impossible. A Mason?"
"A Mason," I replied.
"A sign?"
he said. "It is this," I answered, producing a trowel from beneath the folds of my roquelaire.
"You jest."
he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces.
"But let us proceed to the Amontillado."
"Be it so," I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descending again, arrived at a deep crypt, in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeaux rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead, in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th the bones had been thrown down, and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall thus exposed by the displacing of the bones, we perceived a still interior recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, in height 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no especial use within itself, but formed merely the interval between two of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. "Proceed," I said. "Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lucchesi—"
"He is an ignoramus,"
interrupted my friend, as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and, finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more, and I had fettered him to the granite. In its surface were two iron staples, distant from each other about 2 feet, horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. "Pass your hand," I said, "over the wall. You cannot help feeling the niter. Indeed, it is very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return. No? Then I will positively leave you. But I must first render you all the little attentions in my power."
"The Amontillado!"
ejaculated my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. "True," I replied, "the Amontillado." As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones of which I have before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of my masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in a great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low, moaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier, and the third, and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which, that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction, I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel, and finished without interruption the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the mason work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated, I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope with it about the recess. But the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed, I aided, I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said,
"A very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo, over our wine."
"The Amontillado," I said.
"Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will not they be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone."
"Yes," I said, "let us be gone."
"For the love of God, Montresor."
"Yes," I said, "for the love of God." But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer. I called again, "Fortunato!" No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick, on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat.
Now that you've listened, here's what to read later. Edgar Allan Poe is a personal favorite of ours. The man is famous for many reasons, and he has many accolades to his name. He's credited with writing the first detective story, his short stories are considered the epitome of Gothic literature, and his poetry is some of the world's most recognizable. His fictional stories are captivating, but perhaps even more intriguing is his own life story, including his evil adopted father, his true love and cousin wife, who tragically died young, and his own death, so mysterious that it's still being investigated today. I could go on for hours on this man of mystery, in more ways than one. These stories in particular have a common thread. Rather than stepping into the story in the hero's shoes, the protagonist is the villain. Poe is a master of the unreliable narrator, so you find yourself following the twisted logic of the main characters all the way to the gruesome end. It's a thrill to pull for the other side for once. So if you enjoyed hearing the villain side of the story, if you enjoy a bit of righteous anger, if you appreciate the lush and descriptive romance Poe's writing, and if you can enjoy connecting with even the most unforgivable of characters, then you have to read Heartless by Marissa Meyer. Before the Queen of Hearts met Alice, she was a girl named Kath. Kath was not a girl filled with constant rage, demanding the heads of her enemies, but actually a girl with a dream, to own a bakery and make the most perfect pastries. Catching the eye of the ridiculous King of Hearts should be only a minor setback. After all, the attentions are the opposite of returned. However, when a new jester arrives, Kath finds herself drawn into court by this intriguing and handsome new character. Still, things are not as safe as they seem in Hearts, and what was once thought to be ridiculous may become reality. We here at Listen Now, Read Later are big fans of Marissa Meyer. In fact, going to meet her after the release of her book Renegades was one of the first bookish things the three of us ever did together. And get us started and we could talk forever about the Lunar Chronicles. For this episode, we chose Heartless because it truly is a worthy successor to Poe's dark and brooding tales. In fact, the Jester's sidekick may be familiar to fans of the Gothic storyteller. We know you will devour this lavish, romantic, and tragic story just like we did. So if you loved the revenge stories of Edgar Allan Poe, you have to read Heartless by Marissa Meyer. Thanks for listening to this episode of Listen Now, Read Later. Follow us on Instagram for fun extras and updates on our next episode. Want to support local booksellers and this podcast? Buy Heartless and any other books you want through our bookshop.org affiliate store. Now it's time for you to go read the book, and we'll catch you when you listen later.